Okay, welcome to video 3 of our remote adverse possession class. What we're going to talk about right now is adverse possession when entry is under color of title. But I want to take a step back first and try to put this whole doctrine into context. Remember in our very first class, I told you that property is about the relationship between people vis-a-vis things and land, rather than about things or land themselves or itself. The central question in an adverse possession claim is, what do we do when two people both claim the same piece of land? How do we decide who is, in quotes, the owner? Right? That's a decision that matters a lot, because whoever is the, quote, owner holds the sticks in that bundle. They have the right to sell the land, to improve the land, to mortgage the land, to lease the land, to leave it via will to their legatees, to let it pass through intestate succession to their heirs. None of that can happen until and unless we know who owns the property. What we see in adverse possession is two people advancing claims based on different grounds. The record owner says, here's my deed. I own this property. It says so right there. The adverse possessor says, here are my improvements. Here are my actions. Here is my undisturbed use of this land for X amount of years. I own this property. And the law has to have a rule for deciding whose claim is valid. And as Justice Holmes said, more eloquently than I'm going to say, if a person ignores their property for long enough, they can't complain when the law does as well. And so the adverse possessor's claim is rooted in the passage of time, the notion that the legal owner of the property, who's saying, here is my deed, has not paid any attention to the property, has not even noticed that somebody else has entered the property as a trespasser and has, in an open and notorious fashion, used it as the owner. Okay, so that's the core of why we have this doctrine. And if you think about it, think about 50 years from now. Let's imagine 50 years in the future. And there's somebody on some land and they want to sell it, or they want to get a mortgage on it to finance a business or whatever they want to do. And they inherited it, they thought, from their parents, who inherited it from somebody in our time today. Only there's no record. There's no ownership. And if we go and we look in the records, we see that some random person who nobody knows who they are or where they are is the record owner of the property. And maybe that person doesn't have any heirs. Maybe that person, left the United States to move back to Australia and didn't have a family and died there. Just sort of to make a really strange hypothetical like this. We're now in a situation where that title says that the long dead person in Australia owns the property. And you have people who've been living and working the property for 50 years. And the law needs a way to clean that up and to get rid of old, stale claims that will prevent the functional and productive use of property now. And that's what adverse possession does, right? That's sort of the core of it. I mean, we talk about the situation where we have two people right in front of us saying, no, I'm the owner. But a lot of what the law does is give us a way to clear out old, stale claims. Okay, so reminder, this is the hypo we went over before. This is adverse possession when the adverse possessor enters with no color of title. They enter with no deed that gives them a pretense of legal ownership to the land. A is purely a trespasser. A enters, occupies and improves the back 40 acres in the usual manner. Had O been a diligent or vigilant owner, O would have noticed and kicked A out, but O didn't. And now, well over 10 years have passed, and A is able to claim the back 40 acres, the part that A actually used. A is able to claim through adverse possession. So A enters, right, with no color of title. What A gets is the land that's actually possessed and used in an open and notorious fashion. But if entry is under color of title, and again, color of title means you have a document of some kind. You have an invalid deed that was sold to you by a crook. You have a will that purports to leave you a parcel of land, and unbeknownst to you, the the person who left it to you, in quotes, had already sold it or lost it in a bet. If entry, that's how entry happens under color of title. When entry is under color of title and the other elements of adverse possession are satisfied, so the adverse possessor occupies and possesses the land in an open and notorious fashion for the statutory period, what they get at the end of it is the whole premises described in the document that they have. So not the situation of the adverse possessor who enters without any color of title. They just get what they occupy and use. The adverse possessor who enters with color of title gets the whole premises described in their invalid deed. So let's look at what that looks like. Right? Same situation, we have O, who owned Blackacre for a really long time. Now, notice, for this hypothetical, let's say O doesn't live on the property. Okay, so O is an absentee owner. A has an invalid deed sold to A by Z, who's a crook. A enters the property and says, this back 40 acres, this is the part of the property that I want to live on. I'm going to build my house here. I'm going to put a pool in. And I'm going to let the other 60 acres be a nature preserve, or I like woods. I'm going to leave it as it is. After the statutory period passes, A discovers this problem. Let's say A wants to remortgage the property, and they do a title search and discover that A, in fact, doesn't own the property. So A is in this situation where after the statutory period, A discovers that their deed is, in fact, invalid. They bring a suit to quiet title. They say, I want the whole 100 acres by adverse possession. And if they are an adverse possessor under color of title, meaning that they have a deed that describes that whole 100 acres, they will in fact obtain the whole 100 acres by adverse possession. So they have actual possession of the 40 acres that they're living on and working and using, right, in an open and notorious fashion. And they have constructive possession over the rest of the property, because that's what a deed is. A deed says you own this 100 acres. So the O, who doesn't live there, has constructive possession of the whole thing because they have a deed. A has actual possession of part of the property and constructive possession over the rest of the property. So in a choice between O, whose claim to the property is constructive possession through a deed, and A's claim to the title is actual possession of part of the property and constructive possession, albeit through an invalid deed, of the rest of the property. The question is, whose claim should the law respect? And what the adverse possession title tells us, what the adverse possession statute tells us is, under that circumstance, constructive possession backed by an invalid deed, but anchored on actual possession of part of the property, will beat out a claim from the original owner that's based wholly on constructive possession. So A, in this case, would obtain the entire title to the entire property through adverse possession. Okay, so let's do the more interesting case. Now we have an owner who lives on the 100-acre farm, right? O lives on the property. Again, we have A, who thinks they bought the property from Z, the crook, who enters the property with their invalid deed and uses and improves the back 40 acres as required for the statutory period. After that statutory period is over, and O has never discovered A's presence, so O has not ejected A, as O would have had the right to do until the statute of limitations ended. But after that statute of limitations ends, A clearly has an adverse possession claim to the land they've actually occupied. But A goes to court saying, but I have my deed. I want what I got in Hypo 2, right? I want possession of the entire property. I have actual possession of the back 40 acres to anchor my constructive possession of the rest of the property, admittedly through an invalid deed. But O this time says, no, no, no. I too have actual possession of part of the property, right? The part in red says O lives on the farm. So I too have actual possession of part of this property, and my deed gives me constructive possession over the rest of it. My constructive possession over the rest of it, anchored by actual possession, is based on a valid deed. Yours is based on an invalid deed. When we have to pit constructive possession via deed, anchored by actual possession of part of the property, it has to be that actual possession based on a valid deed beats out constructive possession based on an invalid deed. Remember, they're both claims of constructive possession are anchored by actual possession of part of the property. And under that situation, O will prevail, at least in part. A is still entitled to the back 40 acres that they have used in an open and notorious fashion for the statutory period, because O didn't discover them and didn't eject them during the statutory period. But as for the rest of the property, O's claim to the rest of the property is stronger than A's claim to the rest of the property. So O will keep the rest of the property and A will only get the back 40 acres that they've actually used and possessed for the statutory period. I hope that makes sense. If not, ask me questions in class. Okay, so there's one more permutation that we haven't talked about. Right? What happens when O owns the property but doesn't live there? So we have an absentee record owner, and we have A entering without color of title, but A is entering without color of title to the back 40 acres, doing all the stuff for the statutory period. Right? Our original hypo had A owning the farm, so had A owning the farm and living on the farm. Now we have an adverse possessor who enters against an absentee owner. And realistically, this is what happens more often, right? At the end of the statutory period, can A, who did not enter with color of title, but has actual possession of part of the property, claim the entire property against O, who has constructive possession through a deed of the whole property, but no actual possession? Okay, that seems like it's tricky, but it isn't. The answer is that an adverse possessor without color of title can only acquire the land actually possessed. That's what the statute says. It's wholly unambiguous. So no matter how absentee O is, no matter how absent and neglectful an owner O is, A, in this situation, where they enter without color of title, can only obtain the property that they actually use and possess. There is no constructive possession over the rest of the property for A. Constructive possession only comes from having a deed or a writing of some kind. So this is the big difference between entry with color of title and entry without color of title. If the owner, the record owner, is in residence, then entry with color of title and entry without color of title doesn't change the outcome. Right? O keeps everything except what A has used and improved for the statutory period. But when O is not in residence and A enters and does the stuff with the back 40 acres, whether A entered with color of title or not will determine how much of the property A gets titled to at the end. If A enters with color of title, saying with an invalid deed to the whole property, A will obtain the whole property against an absentee owner. If A enters without color of title, is just a raw trespasser, A will only obtain whatever property A has used and improved. Okay, so those are the permutations. I would like you to answer these questions and submit via TWEN, right, the final set of questions for you. Why does the law make this distinction between adverse possessors who enter with color of title and those who enter without color of title? And then what do you think of this distinction? Does it make a difference from the perspective of the dispossessed original owner? Does it make a difference from the perspective of society as a whole? What do you think about it? Okay, again, you don't have to write me, a tome. A couple of sentences explaining how you're thinking about this is all you need to submit. And I will see you on our next class, where we will pick up with tacking and the disability statute. So hope you are enjoying your first foray into adverse possession. I will warn you, this comes up over and over throughout the class. So you really want to make sure you understand this document.